no government around the world has ever been able to fully eradicate the issue of modern slavery. I mean, even the fact that there's 50 million people estimated to be in modern slavery globally today, that shows a failure, right? But it needs a multi-stakeholder approach, and it needs a multi-government approach too, because if no government in the world has been able to do it individually, I think the only way to do that is through collaboration.
Hello, welcome to The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media here at FS Sustainability. Today's episode is around modern slavery and how fund managers are helping force this very human issue out into the open. Now, Australia's Modern Slavery Act was meant to change corporate behavior. But why is there still little evidence that this has reduced the actual incidence of modern slavery? So in this episode, we ask what genuine leadership looks like from the investor's seat and what companies should be doing right now that goes well beyond compliance. Our guest is Måns Carlsson, OAM, Head of ESG at Ausbil Investment Management, and recipient of the Order of Australian Medal for his contribution to sustainable investment. He is one of the few fund managers in Australia who has been at the coalface of this very serious issue about why modern slavery still exists in 2026. Måns, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Måns, I know that you wear the hat of Head of ESG at Ausbil, but also the co-portfolio manager of Ausbil Active Sustainable Equity Fund. For those who are unfamiliar with the work that you do, can you just walk us briefly through how does the modern slavery component comes into your role?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I do sit on different roles, but I've always looked at it from the investor relevance perspective. And you mentioned compliance before, and I think sadly the Modern Slavery Act has, in some cases, led to a compliance mindset, which is not great. But if I leave the reporting obligation for investors aside, why is this relevant for investors? And also I should make the point that it's not just about what's technically defined as modern slavery, because I think sometimes there can be a gray area between what's technically legally defined as modern slavery, which is at the very extreme side of a spectrum in terms of exploitation, often involving coercion and deception, versus other types of human rights risks. So I look at it more from a starting point of brands are often key assets for companies. Brands and reputations, they can be costly and time-consuming to restore once they've been damaged. And there's some case studies out there. If I look at the UK, for instance, there's a company they call Boohoo. When they faced labor exploitation allegations in their supply chain a few years ago, that share price really tanked and it hasn't really recovered since. That doesn't always happen. Of course, that's an extreme case. But as investors, we prefer stable and predictable earnings. We don't like negative surprises. So that's just a case study of what can go wrong. But ultimately, I'd like to tie it back to earnings sustainability. So if a company's business model relies on underpaid workers, weak regulation, or even illegal activities like modern slavery, that's not going to produce sustainable earnings over time, not in a world where there's increased regulation. And I think the increased regulation we're seeing globally, that's driving that increased financial materiality. So I'm happy to expand on that, of course, but there's different ways governments can address modern slavery. And we're seeing different pathways in different jurisdictions. If I expand, so you have some jurisdictions like the UK and Australia, we've chosen to address this through transparency acts. So essentially reporting on the risks of modern slavery in operations and supply chains. That's one way of doing it. The EU is much more focused on human rights due diligence, which is something, there's a live discussion about that in Australia too, as part of the consultation around changes or potential changes to the Modern Slavery Act. And then you have something which has much more teeth, of course, which is import bans. So import bans are in place in jurisdictions like the US predominantly, but also Canada and Mexico. And the EU is also moving towards import bans on goods made by forced labor. And that's where it can really create holes in earnings. So if you have companies importing goods from a jurisdiction where those goods have been tainted by forced labor, those goods are not coming into the country. And this is why it's a risk that if Australia does not follow other jurisdictions, we might then become the dumping ground for goods made by forced labor. And in turn, if we import goods made by forced labor and then process the goods here for re-export into a jurisdiction where there is an import ban, those goods are going to be blocked, and suddenly, you have a direct impact on earnings.
Absolutely. Can you tell us what would be the next step? So we've had awareness. It feels like a compliance issue right now. What would be the best practice, ideally? Let's say 10 years from now. What should it look like?
I think harmonization is very much a key word here, because even if I look at the term modern slavery, at the moment, the Australian Act, one thing it does well is to actually spell out what it constitutes. So it's very specific about what is modern slavery. It's forced labor, it's bonded labor, it's the worst forms of child labor, etc., etc. So that's clearly defined. But not all jurisdictions around the world have the same definition. So, for instance, labor hire fees, they're technically excessive labor hire fees are technically illegal in a country like Australia, but they're
Hmm.
not necessarily illegal in other jurisdictions in the Asia Pacific region. And this makes it difficult for companies because, on the one hand, they might comply with a local law in the country where they're sourcing from, but that could
Yeah.
be in contradiction to the Australian Modern Slavery Act. So, greater harmonisation, I think that's a key word here in terms of
Hmm.
legislation and what that looks like. I think if the EU is going down the path of human rights due diligence, it would make sense for Australia to consider that too. We've been on record saying that Australia, as a next step, needs to consider some form of human rights due diligence. Import bans is the other thing I mentioned before, and now we're seeing it playing out politically as well. So I think the world needs to address this issue in a similar way, because no government around the world has ever been able to fully eradicate the issue of modern slavery. I mean, even the fact that there's 50 million people estimated to be in modern slavery globally today, that shows a failure, right? But it needs a multi-stakeholder approach, and it needs a multi-government approach too, because if no government in the world has been able to do it individually, I think the only way to do that is through collaboration.
So, what I'm hearing here is harmonization. If you standardize it, it almost feels like all the supply chain issues would be aligned and everyone's talking the same language. But you talked about the domestic market and how this is also a local problem. Let's just say I'm talking to an investor. It's about an ASX 200 company, but they don't really understand how do you do the human rights due diligence. What does that look like from a practical perspective? Is it an annual report that companies provide? Is it you as a fund manager visiting the company or talking to the company 3 to 4 times a year? How does it look like?
Yeah, from a fund manager perspective, this is a really interesting point, because the starting point for me is that there's no way anyone can construct a portfolio that's guaranteed to be modern slavery risk free. I would even say every company has some form of risk, at least deep down in supply chains. So that means it's a systemic issue. And therefore, sometimes I think maybe we put too much emphasis on the risk assessment, because the risk assessment per se is not going to move the dial. Actions might.
Mm.
And when it comes to actions, well, there's two areas that stand out to me. One is that constructive and practical company engagement, and second is that policy advocacy / collaboration with other investors. For instance, we are co-chairing something called Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific. And I think there's a lot of work investors can do collaboratively, and also then encourage policymakers to harmonize laws and have laws have teeth. But if I come back to the company engagement side, the first thing I think is really important to do as a fund manager is to put yourself in the shoes of a company. understand the complexities, and then as a next step, then try to encourage companies to adopt what we think is best practice and seek those win-win-win situations. And I've been very fortunate in my career. I've been to Bangladesh twice. I've been to Cambodia, Thailand, China. And when you see factories and supply companies there, you learn about the complexity of issues. And then you speak to NGOs, unions, workers directly, also leading responsible
Hmm.
sourcing professionals from international companies. And you can learn about what's best practice. So there's a lot of things companies can do. In the RIA Human Rights Working Group, we've done 3 investor toolkits. The third one was published mid last year, sorry. And that's a collection of what we think constitute good practice, among other things, of course, on human rights due diligence. I can speak about this for a long time, but to cut it short, it could be things like having worker voice tools. So rather than relying on annual social audits, well, maybe it's in a company's best
Hmm.
interest to roll out worker voice tools so they can hear directly in real time from workers about the conditions. Because we all know that social audits run the risk of corruption. There's only a spot check at a one particular time, whereas technology actually comes with a number of solutions here. And worker voice tools is one of them. And ultimately, we also encourage companies to build and nurture those long-term relationships with suppliers, to incentivize suppliers to comply with their responsible sourcing standards. And as part of that, there's also a concept called responsible purchasing. Because in some cases, unintended consequences can appear when a company is putting too much pressure on a supplier and it backfires through worsened labor standards. And if I may just throw in an example there, just to illustrate what I mean. When I was in Bangladesh last time, we spoke to a factory owner who said this is about a European retailer that was putting pressure on this particular factory to put solar panels on the roof. And the reason for that, of course, is that this company is under pressure from various stakeholders, including investors, presumably, to decarbonize their supply chain. And that means the
Hmm.
factory isn't asked to put on the solar panels on the roof, but the factory owner was not then given higher prices or anything. In actual fact, the factory owner had to absorb those cost increases, and the retailer was actually asking for lower prices. So you can see what happens there, right? So it's an unintended consequence where
Yeah.
ultimately the factory owner has even less money to pay for workers. So I think that there's a lot of things companies can do smarter. And I would point you to that RIA
Hmm.
toolkit for more specific ideas. But that's where we sit. We want to be practical, not preachy about it, but actually say, here's what other companies are doing. This is what's working, and there's a business case for it with the positive human rights implications. I think that's the role investors can play, and it can be very constructive.
Yes. And I like the point you made earlier that instead of cutting the suppliers, you work with them and elevate their standards and not compromise them as well by saying, hey, put solar panels in, but now I've got less money to pay for wages. I also know that you co-facilitated the workshop at the RIA conference, the Responsible Investment Conference, with financial advisors. What were the key takeaways for you from there? Do you think financial advisors have all the tools they need now to kind of walk and talk with their clients about this issue?
I think it was informative that from what I've heard from the participants of that workshop. I think people learned a lot about the issue. It is a very complex issue. We try to do our best to find ways for all stakeholders to move forward on this topic and really find those solutions. And hopefully they're better equipped also to ask of their fund managers how the fund managers can address this issue. Because, like I said before, we can talk about risk assessments. I can spend months every year to risk assess the portfolio, but I'm actually not making any change by doing that. I think the power sits in the actions themselves. So that comes down to what level of company engagements do you undertake, and what is the nature of those engagements? Are they practical? what are you actually asking of the companies? And then the second lever that investors have, of course, is then to pursue policy advocacy, because I think it's a systemic issue. So the more investors get involved in encouraging policymakers, the better too. And I'm not talking about investors being reporting organizations here under the Modern Slavery Act, but more as in we can encourage a level playing field and greater harmonization around the world. And the tricky part, I think, for all parties, whether you're a financial advisor, a fund manager, or a company, it is how do you keep in tune with what's going on in global supply chains? I mean, there's so many different moving parts. There's regulatory aspects, there's people flows, there's technology flows and changes, and ultimately, how do you make sure you stay on top of what is a global best practice? And I don't think there's any shortcuts here. It is about speaking to companies about it, speaking to NGOs, and is always try to be on top of the latest development. What can we learn from a leader on responsible sourcing that we can then apply to other companies and encourage those companies to do the same?
It feels like every time I ask you a question, it's like, my God, Michelle, we can spend half an hour just on this topic alone. So I totally understand the complexity of this. But if a portfolio company comes to you wanting to improve their credentials and they are cognizant that the human rights issue, it's not standard around the world, what's the one thing you'd tell them to fix before anything else? Or what's the one thing that you immediately point out?
I think the first point for me is always how well do you know your suppliers? And what I mean by that is, do you have a transactional relationship with your suppliers? Or are you incentivizing the supplier to actually comply with your responsible sourcing standards? And the best way to reward
Hmm.
a supplier is to give them more business. If that's broken, if that link's broken, I think it's going to be very hard to fix the issue, and then it becomes a compliance issue. A supplier that's given more business for doing the right thing, well, that supplier is also incentivized to monitor conditions further down the supply chain. Because let's not forget that most of the issues we don't believe are at the first tier of the supply chain. If you look at modern slavery statements, the majority of the discussion that takes place around compliance with the responsible sourcing standards typically talk about tier one suppliers and factories, whereas most of the issues are further
Yes.
down. So a supplier that has a robust business relationship with a buying company, well, that supplier is incentivized to make sure there's no issues further down the supply chain. So that's a win-win.
I heard this. I mean, I've read this about the tier one to tier two to tier three. And Chris Evans, the commissioner, was talking about the subcontracting on subcontracting. And you really need to know more about the suppliers that you work with. Finally, Måns, as a fund manager, how can you hold portfolio companies accountable after you've had this conversation with them? What happens when a company falls short?
Yeah, I mean, for the Active Sustainable Fund, we have a minimum ESG requirements. We screen out companies for various reasons. One of them is on human rights grounds, and we reserve the right to exclude from our investable universe companies which take a recalcitrant approach on human rights issues. In the portfolio, which is a very concentrated portfolio, typically 35 stocks, so we don't really see that issue in the portfolio companies we have at the moment. Not on a widespread scale where we have issues with a particular company as such. But of course, this is an ongoing conversation we have with companies, particularly companies we think are high risk. So this is like an ongoing theme for us. So the world is not as black and white as I alluded to before, where we screen out bad companies and only invest in good companies. So it is a complex issue, and what we want to see ultimately are companies trying their best. Companies that are open to adopting better practices, and I can think of 3 companies in our portfolio where we've had some very involved engagements, multi-year engagements, by the way. So in one case, actually more than 10 years. And as long as we keep seeing
Mm.
progress, I think that's a positive. So I don't want to leave you with the thought that a company needs to be absolutely perfect and that's it. I think it's about staying with the companies, supporting them, giving them ideas, like practical ideas of what they should be doing, leaning on what's global best practice. And as long as companies are then adopting that, it's not going to happen overnight, of course, but as long as you see continued change, you're actually part of the solution. And that's the role I see us as having.
And from your experience, I know that it's very hard to say, hey, there is a direct correlation between a company improving their standards and working with you to their earnings or their share price. But from your experience, have you seen that happen? Where you see, wow, the share price has gone up and this is because of the work that you've done in the last 5 years or 10 years within your business operations, that you're in a really strong position now?
I think if I speak to ESG in general, we can see that link. And I think one of the acid tests, of course, for us as a fund manager is to look at the performance of the fund. So this particular fund, we exclude almost, it's ranging between 20 to 25% of the ASX 200, but we managed to outperform index since inception. So that tends to show that a universe that's refined on ESG grounds can actually deliver outperformance. That's the first thing. And then the academic literature seems to suggest that the way to create alpha or outperformance from ESG tends to be about avoiding the main laggards and then equally invest in companies that are improving on ESG. But more philosophically, I can also say that, well, if a company is improving their risk management, the risk exposure might still be there. And modern slavery is one of those where it is high risk. It's high risk in many sectors, many companies. But the better a company does on risk management, the lower the risk that the company is going to be caught up in some kind of scandal, either from a reputational perspective or a regulatory perspective. And it comes back to what I said before. As investors, we prefer predictable and sustainable earnings. And as you know, we hate negative surprises. So the more a company does in this area, the more reassurance we have. And hopefully that pays off over time as well. But it's very hard to know if and when these issues will pop up. And I mentioned one extreme case before, which is, is every fund manager's nightmare to have a portfolio company where the stock price tanks because of something like this. And it doesn't always happen. But the more we can encourage companies to improve their risk management practices, the less risk of that happening in the portfolio.
Well said. I feel like we've come full circle now from where we started the conversation to now. Once again, Måns, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
This is Michelle Baltazar for The Greener Way. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.